Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, we scour the earth for pro-lifers, looking over under rocks, over trees, and we found someone from the Isle of Jersey, over there near England and Ireland, and he's going to talk to us today about end-of-life issues, where we often talk about beginning-of-life issues. So today, end-of-life issues. Welcome the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, Alex Schadenberg. Well, welcome, Alex.
Hi, Brendan. As you know, I'm a Canadian, but I just happen to be speaking in Jersey today. I just got back from a presentation, and in 2 days I'll be speaking in Ireland, in Dublin. So you might want to join me there with your Irish past. But anyway, so let's talk about end of life, and
Right.
hopefully we can get a lot of information out.
What is the status? I know that I had you on at one point several years ago, and you said, well, we win a lot of battles, but they just keep trying to chip away year after year. What's the status in America and worldwide? What is going on with euthanasia and affiliated maladies?
Well, what's happening in the U.S. is in the last 2 years, the assisted suicide lobby's pushed hard to try and legalize assisted suicide in more states in the U.S. And in the last 2 years, they have failed. They haven't actually, expanded the number of states that have legalized assisted suicide. So right now in the U.S., there's 10 states that have legalized assisted suicide or have assisted suicide. And that's been the same place for the last 2 years. They've put a lot of money into trying to expand it, but they failed. What they have done, though, sadly, is they've expanded the laws that already exist. So they will go into a state trying to legalize assisted suicide, and they'll come in with a bill, then they'll say it's very tight, and we're presenting this bill with all these sort of safeguards in it, etc. And then they go back a couple years later and they expand the law because they say, well, that first bill was only there to legalize. Now we're going to expand it. So for instance, right now they're talking about assisted suicide again in Massachusetts, and they have a bill that they've been debating, and they're saying, well, this is a tightly worded bill, Brendan. It's a tightly worded bill, but in fact, you see, the idea is you get whatever you can get passed, whatever the legislature is willing to vote for, whatever elected members of the legislature are willing to do. That's what you do, because they're trying to get it legalized, and after that they will expand it. So that's the whole what's going on in the U.S. right now.
Can you give us an example of a state or two that is doing that sort of thing?
Well, for instance, Oregon, which is the state that legalized assisted suicide in the U.S. first, it recently removed its residency requirement. And the same thing also happened in Vermont, which hasn't had assisted suicide that long. So what they do is by removing the residency requirement, they're allowing people who don't live in their state to die by assisted suicide. In Washington state, what they've done is they've changed their waiting period. They've also added to the list of who can do assisted suicide, meaning it was originally just doctors, now it's also nurses. And they've also been redefining the act as to what is a chronic condition, what is a terminal condition. In Vermont, they've decided they're going to allow it to be done by telehealth. So they're saying that you don't have to ever visit the doctor. You can talk to them, and like we're talking right now, you can talk over a screen with each other. The doctor can approve you and never actually have to meet you. And so that would actually expand access to assisted suicide, because you don't have to go to the doctor. You simply have to talk to the doctor. And there's been several other expansions that have gone on in the U.S., but this is the kind of thing they're trying to expand it as to how many people can participate in it. And that's what's going on. Now, just to give you an interesting thing, the California law, they expanded in 2020, and in that bill, they got rid of the waiting periods, etc. They expanded several things about the law, but they also said they changed the law so that affected conscience rights for physicians. So what happened is a group of physicians who were opposed to assisted suicide then hired a group of lawyers, and they challenged the new definitions in the law that forced them to have to be involved with the law. And they were saying that if we're not willing to do assisted suicide, we can't be forced also to be, participating in the act. And in the end, the judge that heard the case agreed with them and said, this is actually taking away the rights of these physicians because you're forcing them to participate in an act they don't believe in.
Well, that sounds like a good thing then, what has occurred.
That was a victory. Yes, that was a
Yeah.
legal victory. And that actually also affected the law because you also had another state, you had New Mexico. New Mexico had done the same thing. They were forcing physicians to have to participate in the act. They said you don't have to do it, but you have to do referrals. You have to be involved in it. And they were refusing to do that because they're saying, if I'm not going to kill you, why would I refer you to someone who will kill you? And so what happened is by California doctors taking that case and to the courts and winning to protect their conscience rights, the New Mexico government simply dropped that part of the law, requiring doctors to participate because they thought, well, the precedent was set in California. We're not going to win in New Mexico either. And so that, doctors are being protected. At least their consciences are being protected. That's correct. Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing, yes.
And I was reading on your website that the euthanasia rate in the province of Quebec is high. Is that, are we watching or seeing the slippery slope of euthanasia take hold?
So, Brendan, what's going on in Canada is we've legalized euthanasia. So it's a little different than assisted suicide, but it's got the same intention and the same outcome. So in euthanasia, the doctor actually injects you. They actually kill you. Whereas in assisted suicide, it's similar, but the doctor would then prescribe you the lethal drugs, but you have to take it yourself. So the intention is the same. The intention is to cause your death. The outcome's the same. You're dead. The difference is how it's done. With assisted suicide, you have to take the drugs yourself. It's a form of suicide, whereas euthanasia is the doctor does it to you. So it's a form of homicide, murder. Now, Canada legalized euthanasia by creating an exception in its criminal code. There's an exception in Canada's criminal code to euthanasia, to allow doctors to kill their patients under these prescribed terms. So what's happened is the latest data came out of Canada, and there was the increase of euthanasia deaths in Canada in 2022 was by 31%. Now you may say that sounds like sad news, Alex, but what does it mean? There's actually been a 30% increase upon another 30% increase upon another 30% increase. So the last 3 years, every year there's been an over 30% increase in the number of deaths. And so if you compound it, it's very significant, the number of deaths. There was 13,241 in Canada in 2022. But on top of it, Quebec had 6.6% of all their deaths were euthanasia. They are now the highest percentage of euthanasia in the world. It's actually quite significant if you consider the fact that Canada only legalized euthanasia in 2016, whereas the Netherlands legalized it in 2002. So sadly, Quebec has gone hook, line, and sinker into killing its patients, into doctors killing their patients, and it's now the highest rate in the world. Just to give you a comparison, and I know people in the U.S. probably have no idea where Newfoundland is. I think you probably know where it is, Brendan, because you've traveled so much. But Newfoundland had a 1.2% of all deaths were euthanasia in Canada. Newfoundland had that number, whereas Quebec was 6.6%, which is the highest in the world.
Wow. And what about, I think over in Europe, they have tourism. You can travel to Switzerland, and also you can euthanize, I guess, children.
Right. Well, we have the same thing going on in Canada with the children. At least we're debating it right now. The big debate right now is whether we can allow euthanasia for children. But in the Netherlands and Belgium, you have euthanasia of children. But in Switzerland, you have assisted suicide tourism, meaning you don't have to be a Swiss citizen. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that Oregon and Vermont have dropped the residency requirements in their state. So that means Oregon and Vermont have become assisted suicide tourist states. Now, I don't like talking about it because it means that even though Massachusetts hasn't legalized assisted suicide, citizens of Massachusetts can go to Vermont and die by assisted suicide, or they can go to Oregon. It shows you how things are really shifting quickly now in the attitude, because there is a doctor in Oregon who set up an assisted suicide clinic. So he is taking out-of-state residents, and he's approving them for assisted suicide, so they only have to buy a one-way ticket to Oregon. This isn't pleasant to talk about, but the fact of it is in the U.S., it's assisted suicide has always been a state-by-state issue. But since Oregon and Vermont removed their assisted suicide residency requirement, therefore anybody can go there. That means that it's become a national issue because it's legal to anyone in America.
And if they were to get more states, eventually, would this go into our legal system and percolate up to the United States Supreme Court?
Well, there already has been a Supreme Court decision on assisted suicide. So in 1997, there was the Glucksberg decision on assisted suicide. So the Supreme Court has already decided that there's no right to assisted suicide in America. I'm not sure if there could be another case that could go to the Supreme Court, but what's happening right now is that the current Supreme Court would have a majority against assisted suicide. So if there were a case, I'm assuming it would actually take the position that assisted suicide is not only not a legal right, but there's something discriminatory about it. There is a court case right now in California. So there's a group of people with disabilities who have launched a court case in California challenging the California assisted suicide law. They're saying that it's discriminatory. It actually violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. So what they're arguing is that the California assisted suicide law is therefore against the law. It's actually unconstitutional, and it needs to be struck down based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think their case is actually correct. I think how they've assessed it is actually correct, because people who are dying by assisted suicide, often they're dying because they have a disabling condition. Now, the law is defined as that they have a 6-month prognosis. But most often, what the reason they're asking for is, and you look at this in the data, has to do with the fact that they have lost certain abilities as they're approaching death. And they're saying that they would rather have assisted suicide. This is a very important issue also, because a lot of people with disabilities already feel that they are discriminated against in the healthcare system. So if you have assisted suicide, they feel a further level of discrimination in the system based on the fact that assisted suicide does focus in on their lives.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about record keeping. How do you know who's died from assisted suicide and who hasn't? I mean, because you've got a dead patient. Is the doctor required to file paperwork, or do they just don't file anything?
It's a very good question, Brendan, and it's a very important question, because I'll give you an example in Oregon. So every year in Oregon, the state publishes the number of assisted suicide deaths. So you have this report coming out, and last year there was, I think it was in the 270s, the people who died or reportedly died by assisted suicide. I believe it was 279. I don't have it in front of me, so I have to go by my memory. But the report also said that there was 101 people in Oregon in 2022 who received the lethal drugs. They know they died. They know they received the lethal drugs, but they don't know how they died. So how the system works is the doctor who approves your assisted suicide is also the doctor who prescribes the lethal drugs, is also the doctor who's required by law to report after your death. Now, the doctors actually are rarely at your death. Now, what do I mean by that? In the state of Oregon, they're not required to be at your death. They're not required to be there. So because they're not required to be there, having to tell the estate whether or not your death fulfilled the requirements of the law is actually of no meaning, because they weren't there. I'll give you one other big thing to pull this together on data. When you look at the Oregon report, they know they have a certain number of people who died by assisted suicide. And then it says 101 people. We know they received the lethal drugs. We know they died. We just don't know how they died, right? Mm-hmm. They have no idea how they died. Now, those 101 could be assisted suicide, or some of them could be assisted suicide. Or, of course, it could all be natural deaths. We just don't know. We have no idea. And, of course, the Oregon Department of Health makes it very clear they have no authority. They've been given no authority, and they've been given no budget to investigate. So they simply don't know. The same situation occurs in California and in Washington State. So if you look at the reports, it also shows you this number in the data. But let me go one step further. I mentioned that the doctors are rarely at the death. So when we're looking at the reports and it refers to complications, it refers to time of death and all these kind of things, the report shows you that about half of the information on those who they know died, so they have, as I said, about 279 that they reportedly said died by assisted suicide, about half of that data they actually don't have any real data for. They know they died. A report came in saying they died by assisted suicide, but they don't know how long it took them to die. They don't know if there was complications. They don't know anything because, of course, the doctor sent in a report with no information in it, just saying, yes, that person died by assisted suicide. The doctor wasn't at the death. It would only be anecdotal evidence at most if they were actually to fill in that report as the report requested to. So the whole thing about record keeping and information, it's very hard for a state like Oregon when we're talking about assisted suicide. But let me go one step further how bad this is. The record keeping is actually quite insane. According to the Oregon law, it's the same thing in California and Washington State. 12 months after the report is published, they destroy all the data. So let's say there is a significant concern about how somebody died. Let's say a family member has brought up some serious, legitimate concerns about that assisted suicide death. There'd be no way to look at the report because, first of all, the report's considered privacy, but secondly, it's destroyed in 12 months. So, the whole concept of being able to have oversight of the law is missing in assisted suicide in America.
Why are they destroying it? What's the intent or the purpose of destroying that information?
Well, it's the same thing that they make it very hard to get the data. So, for instance, there was a case a couple of years ago where a lawyer was hired by a son of someone who died by assisted suicide, and they contacted the Oregon Department of Health, the lawyer, and they asked for this information because the son was saying that his brother, so the other son, had actually caused the dad's death. So the lawyer was trying to get the information, and they were barred from getting the information. They said, this is privacy. This is medical information. They do not have the right to. Then they got the police involved, and the police then agreed to do an investigation based on a credible complaint. And the police were also denied by the Department of Health to receive that information. I'm not saying there was anything in the report that would have indicated there was a problem, but it was kept secret based on privacy. Now, why did they destroy it? They're worried about people like Alex Schadenberg possibly picketing someone's house or something like that. But the fact of it is I'm more interested in trying to save life than I am about picketing someone's house. We're not interested. And on top of it, the data doesn't actually tell me, first of all, the data doesn't tell me any names, but they don't want me to get any reports. I would have no access to it anyway. The Dutch are actually, funny enough, the Dutch do a lot of killing with their euthanasia law, but they're actually more honest than the rest of us. And the reason is they've allowed significant research to be done on their euthanasia data because they keep the reports. So, if you're, let's say, a university student and you're trying to do significant research on the question of euthanasia in the Netherlands, they will give you access to, let's say, 2,000 of these death reports. And you go through them all and you can look through the data. You can find out what their conditions were. There's certain medical information that's in there. Now, of course, the name might be redacted, so you have no idea what the name is. But at least they're honest enough to say, this is important information that can be researched. In the U.S., there's no access to it.
Wow, that's something. Now, you have a note here about Canada's MAID program, that it's gone mad. MAID is capital M-A, small I-D, capital D. What is that, and what do you mean by it's gone mad?
In Canada, we have redefined what euthanasia is by calling it something else. So we call it MAID. They came up with this term MAID, medical aid in dying, in order to make us feel better about killing. So they decided they don't like the term euthanasia. They don't like the term assisted suicide. They even didn't like the term assisted death. They decided it had to be MAID, medical aid in dying. My writing about how MAID has gone mad in Canada, really what I've done is I've recounted the stories, and these are stories from the media. They're not stories that I wrote and made up or anything like that. They're not stories from someone calling me up and it's all anecdotal third-party evidence or whatever. These are direct stories from media articles and interviews of people who have either A, died by assisted suicide or euthanasia, or B, been approved for it, and they're talking about their whole situation. So the thing about Canada is we started with euthanasia for terminal illness. We then got rid of the terminal illness provision in our law, and now you can have euthanasia for what they call irremediable medical conditions. So what that means is people with disabilities qualify for euthanasia based on having a disability. But I'm going to go one step further. We've now had euthanasia based on poverty, based on homelessness, based on an inability to receive medical treatment, based on just basic disability. So you have people who are qualifying for euthanasia because they have a disability, but they're asking for it because they're living in poverty. So when I said that MAID in Canada has gone mad, what I'm saying is the law has gone crazy. Now, let me give you a nice little quick story to pull this together. Recently, in June of this year, a woman named Catherine Metler went to the Vancouver General Hospital because she was experiencing suicidal ideation. She decided she needed help. She was suicidal. She had been suicidal before and received help. She's someone who's experienced mental health issues. The counselor told her, now remember, this is in June of this year of 2023. The counselor told her, you will not be able to see a psychiatrist till November at the earliest because they're all booked up. And we do not have a psychiatric bed for you. And then the counselor said to her, have you thought about medical aid in dying? So have you thought about euthanasia? This is the kind of thing that we have going on in Canada now. It's insane that somebody who's actually seeking help because they're experiencing suicidal ideation is being offered euthanasia.
Wow, that's really something. And now you had a conference recently in Grand Rapids, Michigan. What was that all about? Who did you have at the conference, and what was the purpose?
Well, our last conference was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the reason is because the euthanasia-assisted suicide lobby in the U.S. is now focusing on Michigan as the next state that they want to legalize, assisted suicide in, and so they've been hiring staff. They've been focusing on Michigan. You might remember in the last election that Michigan not only elected a Democrat governor, they elected a majority Democrat Senate and House. But their governor is actually very, very, very pro-assisted suicide. So, the assisted suicide lobby is trying to legalize assisted suicide in Michigan. So we were there having our conference to try and help provide information and training and direction for those who are going to be fighting assisted suicide. And that's why we were in Michigan. And we see that on multiple state levels. The other thing is we made sure to make sure that our conference was available online for people. So people in Massachusetts and other states who are also trying to stop the legalization of assisted suicide could receive the same information live from us.
Mm-hmm. I had a classmate from Georgetown University that ran and lost to the current governor, a guy named Bill Schuette is his name. Well, are there other concerns that you see going down the road with euthanasia that people should be aware of?
Well, right now in Canada, we legalized euthanasia for mental illness, and it's going to come into legal place. It's going to be actually offered starting in March of 2024. Now, recently there was a bill in Canada's Parliament by a Conservative member of Parliament to try and reverse that. Now, obviously speaking, I already told you that we have had problems with euthanasia for poverty, euthanasia for homelessness, euthanasia for people who can't get medical treatment, people with disabilities who have been offered euthanasia, and it's been a scourge on us. So much so it's even been politically affecting the whole political system. But even then, if you add euthanasia for mental illness into the question, you have a serious concern also because of the fact there's lots of people who are homeless who have mental health concerns. There's lots of people who are homeless who have addiction issues, problems with addictions and things like that. And now you're going to extend euthanasia to them. So this is a big concern. A few weekends ago in Victoria, British Columbia, there was a conference that the Canadian government put on euthanasia for mental illness, because of course they're trying to get the doctors ready to start killing for mental illness reasons. And one of the topics that came up was addiction. And the question was, would euthanasia then be available to people who have addiction issues? And the answer was, yes, that would be very complicated, but addiction is also a form of mental illness, therefore it would be available to people with addictions also. So, as much as killing is crazy, it leads to more killing. On top of it, it starts getting out of control. As I'm talking to you about it now, we haven't started killing people for mental illness. We haven't started killing people based on addictions. So to most people that are hearing this, they're saying this sounds crazy. Sadly, once we start doing it, people will say, oh, well, maybe that was necessary. Well, guess what? There's a lot of homeless people we could kill. And I don't think that's the way we should ever be handling it. But it seems to be that's the way the country's going.
Wow. Well, Alex, we really appreciate you taking the time to cross the
Now, I hope I
ocean,
didn't depress your audience, Brendan.
the pond, across the pond. And it's great to see you again, and hopefully you'll have a good time in Dublin without me. I wish I were there. But anyways, thanks so much for being on the show today. And folks, we hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.